I've got a history of working with the Microsoft UC stack for a long, long time. And as you'll know, that UC stack sort of started out with, Link and the previous OCSs, etc. Evolved into Skype for Business, evolved into Teams. But one of the things that we'll talk about as we go through is, even if you've got a background and a history in that Skype for Business stack, Teams is a slightly different beast because you've got those two different workloads. You've got the collaboration workload and you've got the communications workload. So even if you're familiar with, maybe you're more on the SharePoint side and you've got more of an understanding about identity and content and management, then in the MS700, because it's covering Teams, which blends all of those things, there's these two different sides that you need to be aware of. So just to set some expectations about what I'm talking about today is not a guide comprehensively on how to pass the exam, because this is a 40-minute session. We don't have enough time to cover all of that sort of stuff. This isn't a training session. It's not an exam dump. I do have a few questions. If we get that far at the end, you might have some questions for me. Please don't. But what I want to try and get across is an understanding of what is covered in the MS700. So you can figure out maybe it's something you want to take. There's two new exams, potentially. We'll talk about them in a minute. There's the MS740 and the MS720. So I'd cover a little bit about where the 700 sits against those, and maybe if they're still a thing. We'll see, spoilers. But I'll also talk about, hopefully, how you can allocate your time. So talk about what the split is between the content in the exam, so you can identify where your weaker areas may be to concentrate a little bit more on there. And also a few ideas of how to go about studying, how to get yourself set up and running. So first of all, what is the MS700? Has anybody here taken it already? I'm assuming some people at the front, yeah. So has anybody taken any of the Microsoft exams? Even the old school ones, not necessarily some of the newer ones, a couple. So there was a revamp of the certification program from Microsoft a couple of years ago, something like that, maybe slightly longer. I forget with, what with one thing and another these days, that time sort of stretches out a little bit. But there was a bit of a revamp of the certification program to be more job role orientated. And this is a list of some of those job roles off the Microsoft site. So MS700, what we're talking about here, fits a little bit, well, mostly under the administrator, hence, it's the Teams administrator exam, but it also sits a little bit with the solutions architect side of things. There's a bit of crossover with some security, et cetera, et cetera. There are 3 levels of certification, roughly. There are some specialist ones that don't fit into this bracket, but you have a fundamentals certification, you have an associate level certification, and you have an expert level certification. The MS700 is an associate level certification, and that builds into an expert, level if you want to by taking some other exams, and I've got a diagram that shows that. But the important thing to bear in mind that taking an exam does not always equal the certification. For MS700 it does. If you take the MS700 exam, you become the associate, Teams administrator title. But for the expert levels, normally you have to take 3 or 4 exams before you then get the certification. So there is, it's not necessarily a direct correlation. That link down at the bottom will take you to this poster, which is tiny, I'm afraid, but hopefully you can see across the top that we've got Azure M365, Dynamics 365, Power Platform, and then for some reason down the bottom, we've got the security, compliance, and identity. And you can see the exams up there. So given we're talking about Teams, we'll do a little zoom in on the M365 stuff there, and you can see the exams that are available in that technology space. So you've got here the MS740, and you've got here the MS700. And then on the right, this bit's talking about how those certifications build up. You can see if you want to get that, expert level certification, that you need to take one of the prereq exams down the left-hand side, then the 2 in the middle, and that then gets you the expert level certification. So the good news from an MS700 point of view is that is one of those prereq options here. So you can take that, then the other 2, and then you get that higher level certification if that's where your career path is taking you and that's what you want to do. So where does this fit? I think I've kind of covered this, that it's the associate level, it is a single exam, but there are 2 other exams that were talked about more recently. So MS740 is a team support engineer associate exam. So it's associate level, and it is orientated around a team support engineer. That was in beta in the middle of this year. I think technically the beta period sort of stops mid-August, something like that. I don't know if you can still book it at the moment, but if you have a look on the MS site, it does say that they're pending feedback from customers. So the process for building an exam is they pull the content together, they get the questions written by farming them out to people who provide them, who are experts in that area. And then they put all of those into a big old exam, make it available. Used to be for free, now it's for 80% off, I think, for people to sit. And it's quite an arduous process sitting a beta exam because they are very, very lengthy. It's pretty much all of the content that they have available. And you don't get scored straight away like you do in a normal exam. So there's this period where they review and they trend how many people got a particular question right, so they can see if the question's maybe not worded correctly, or maybe it's a bit too hard, or it doesn't quite fit with the goals. So MS740 is going through that process at the moment. And then at one of the Ignite sessions from earlier in the year, there was someone talked about the MS720 coming along, which was orientated around the Teams voice engineer certification. Now, I believe that exam is potentially not going to come out. I don't know if there's not enough content for it, to achieve the right level of stuff. Or one of the things that I've got later on we'll talk about is the difference between the 700 and 740. And the 700's been rejigged recently. So about a couple of months ago, they changed the amount of content that's in there, which is a bit unfortunate if anybody out there happens to have written a book about how to take the exam, which they started over a year ago. So who is the MS700 for? The right-hand side is the official list of requirements. And then the translation of that is actually, it's somebody who looks after teams for their organization, or somebody who wants to look after teams for their organization. Ideally, you will have had 6 to 12 months of hands-on experience to take the exam, but that is not a hard and fast rule. That just means you will find it easier and simpler if you've done that. You can pass these exams by being familiar with how Microsoft exams flow, how they work, how Microsoft word the questions, and just from doing book learning, or just reading docs.microsoft.com until it falls out your ears and you fall asleep. But ideally, you will have been doing this stuff, to be in the best position to take it. Because it's Teams, because Teams sits on top of and alongside a whole bunch of other services, you do need to have awareness around Azure Active Directory and Exchange and SharePoint and OneDrive for Business. So it's not just that you need to know how to admin Teams itself, because that cascades into all of these different technologies. So how does that compare to the MS740? So again, down the right-hand side, if anybody wants to read it, is the official requirements taken off the website. The translation is that this one is actually more orientated to people who not to administer. So administering is defining policies for your organization, making sure people can do what they need to be able to do, making sure people can't do what you don't want them to do. Whereas the 740 is more of a support engineer kind of a role. It's troubleshooting. It's identifying when something's gone wrong, how you can fix it, who they need to look at. And again, you do still need to have awareness of when something's going wrong. Is that something actually with Teams, or is it with AD, or is it somewhere else? So you still, again, need to have that familiarity. But probably you're looking at, 6 months of hands-on experience rather than, up to a year's worth. So how might you prepare for the MS700? So what should you expect on the day? The exam is roughly 180 minutes, split into probably 30 minutes for pre and post. So pre is there can be a sample exam to show you the format, so you get used to how the setup works. I don't know what the deal is with in-person exams, but obviously, with one thing and another, recently it was the proctored only was the option. So you had to have a room at home with an open space, and you had to take photos of in front of you, behind you, to the left of you, to the right of you. Steelers wheels. Send it, over to the proctor, who then checks that you don't have any posters or anything that you shouldn't have around you. But also, it's kind of weird that you have to have, your computer, your webcam on. I did an exam proctored, and I got told off by the proctor because I was sat leaning against my desk with my hand, on my chin. You're not allowed to cover your mouth in any way, shape, or form. So there is someone who is watching what you're doing, because potentially I could have been, whispering to somebody or having someone whisper to me, etc. Or, the good old-fashioned scenario was you go into a test center, you use one of their computers. There's less chance of stuff not quite working out. I know my wife tried to take one of the AWS proctored exams, and I actually ended up being booted out of the system and then lost the slot. And, you know, so there can be a bit of grief with it. If you're doing proctored, just make sure you log in early, you make sure your computer meets their requirements, and you should be all right. The exam itself is usually between 50 and 70 questions. It does vary, because there's a large bank that they then pull down, and there is normally going to be at least one scenario-based question. With the exams, you can usually move freely backwards and forwards through them, but you can't in a scenario question. So a scenario question gives you a whole bunch of information, maybe some diagrams, and you've got a little section down the left-hand side that you can click through that's like, these are the InfoSec requirements, these are the HR requirements, these are the legal requirements, this is the overview. And there'll be about 10 questions that relate to that scenario. And be aware that once you've come out of that scenario, you can't go back into it. That's important for something that we'll talk about in a minute. The pass rate is 700 out of 1,000. That doesn't mean that it's a 70% pass rate, because some of the questions are weighted differently in the exam, because some of them might be select more than one answer or do more than one thing. Some of the questions might be beta questions that have been inserted into the test to gauge how people respond to those. They might not actually have any score attached to them. Roughly speaking, if you're taking practice tests, you should be aiming to have about a 75 to 80% pass rate. Will get you over that, 700 out of 1,000. Question types, the good old-fashioned standard Microsoft tests were A, B, C, D, multiple choice. You will have the majority of the test will be those. There's some text and you pick answers A, B, C, or whichever apply. Some will be hot areas where you have to click on an image on the screen of where would you go to configure something, or where would you find a particular setting. And some of them are drag and drop, so like put these things in the right order. And that right order might be little snippets of PowerShell code. So you do a get this and then a pipe it into this and build that up. I don't believe the MS700 has simulations, but it is something Microsoft does do in their exams, where you're provided with an environment that you log into, and it's just a live environment. You can click around, and then they kind of check that the configuration at the end matches whatever they've asked you to do. I don't think they have them in the MS700 at the moment. And you do have the opportunity to feed back on questions. So if you're absolutely sure that something is wrong with a question, then you can flag that. And after you have completed the exam, you can go back and provide feedback on specific questions, which I did for mine because I messed something up. Turns out that it was something I wasn't aware of. There is a mindset for how you deal with these questions. You have to answer the questions as though you are the most straight-laced, by the letter, Microsoft person that there is, which means that if it's what it says on docs.microsoft.com, that's what you answer the question as. It's not what you do in real world. It's not what you do in real life. Unfortunately, this is testing, the letter of how Microsoft says you should do things. And I think we all know that that doesn't necessarily equate to how you would do something in the real world. So just be aware of that. This is an enterprise grade exam, so be an enterprise administrator, whether that's your current job role or not. So you have to think the bigger picture about what's the impact to other portions of the business. If we're talking about licensing, assume that this is like an E5 grade where you've got all of the security tools, all of the toys, all of the things. That's how these are being asked and you should be answering. If you aren't sure, flag a question and move on. Don't stall on it. Maybe spend a few minutes, 5 minutes, figuring it out, and you'll see if we get to some of the sample questions, they can be a bit, tricksy in how they word stuff. Not deliberately, but just, like making content for these things is slightly hard. So you end up with stuff that's subtly different. But if you're not sure, flag it and move on. Other than when you're in that scenario section where you can't go back, chances are there will be another question later on that asks something similar that maybe you weren't sure which particular PowerShell switch or commandlet it was, and because you had like a choice of two, but on another question, you've got one and then another, and that's like, well, that means that on this question, it was B instead. So, don't be afraid to come back to them if you need to. And read them. There are clues in the phrasing of the questions. There aren't really superfluous words in the questions, but it might be, you have a problem and you need to solve it in the most effective manner, or in the most time efficient manner, or in the most repeatable manner. So the answer might be there twice, that you can go and do something in TAC in the admin portal, or it can be you run PowerShell. But the clue about that you need to be able to do it in a repeatable fashion, well, the repeatable fashion means that it's the PowerShell answer that they're looking for. So look for those kind of clues in it as well. The scenario questions, like I said, they can be very wordy, and it is very tempting. And I'm not saying don't read things thoroughly or skip through it, but in the scenario questions, you can kind of get yourself a bit tied up in a knot because there is a lot of information in there. So what I tend to do with those is I read the high level overview of the scenario of roughly, your Tailspin Toys, Contoso, whatever it is, roughly what the scenario is. And then I go to the first question and look at the first question. And the first question will say something like, you configure this in your tenant. Does this meet the requirements for HR and for legal? And you're like, aha. Down the left-hand side is like, click. There's my HR requirements. Read through that and find what the specific detail that I should be looking for the question. Now look at, the HR ones, find it, and that then leads you to the answer, as opposed to having to spend 10 minutes reading the entire thing and then you've forgotten what the first bits were. So again, it's just a little bit of a process for how to go through them. What can you do to prep yourself for the MS700? Ideally, you will have access to an M365 E5 tenant, right? Everybody's got one of them at home that they pay for themselves in their lab, right? Cool. If you don't have that, if you work for a Microsoft partner, you might have access to one of the things called a CIE, the Customer Immersion Experience Environment. Either will do. What a CIE is, and you can get to it from demos.microsoft.com, but a CIE lets you spin up a tenant that lasts for 90 days or a year, and it gives you 25 E5 trial licenses that you can pretty much do what you want. And even if you need to have experience with phone system, you can add phone system into that license. And every person who is registered against a Microsoft partner should be able to, if they've got the right competencies as a partner, should be able to spin up those CIEs. So really, that's the best way of doing it if you can. If you don't, and you really are struggling and your company, won't let you mess around for live in their real world environment while you're testing all these things out, you can sign up for a 30-day trial of an E3 or an E5. If you follow the link there down the right-hand side, there is a trial, and you fill in your details and you'll get an environment for 30 days that you can mess on with. Just be careful that you don't then roll that over into something that you're paying 25 E3 licenses for by mistake. Didn't happen to me. So the exam content itself. The content does evolve the same way that Teams evolves. So if you looked at the documents from Microsoft in July, this is, or before July, if you were, say, writing a book on the subject, this is how you would have structured what you were doing. You'd have, had planning, managing chat calling and meetings, and then managing Teams and app policies. If you looked at it after July, and one of the reasons that this changed is Skype for Business Online went away, right? That was a pretty reasonable chunk of the planning and configuring section, because there's all the stuff about coexistence modes, about interop and all that sort of stuff. That's now not as much of a thing. Still a thing if you're in hybrid to some degree, but you don't have the choice about whether you're in collab and meetings mode or whatever. You're just, if you're online, you're in Teams only, full stop. So what this now looks like today is we've got slightly less on the planning and configuring, still the majority of the exam, 35 to 40%. But there's other stuff that's been slipped in there, which I'm going to go through these sections probably, reasonably speedily. But again, this PowerPoint is available if anybody wants to have a look, and go on the MS700 website, download the actual PDF, which gives you a listing of the breakdown of these things. Next up is managing chat, Teams, channels, and apps. So, apps has kind of been slotted in here. It was quite a major section under the managing chat calling and meetings, and now it's explicitly called out in the title that is something to be concerned about in that section. Managing calling and meetings, and then there's this new one, the monitoring and troubleshooting the Teams environment. So you remember I said about the MS720 and the MS740 and how they kind of fit in. It looks like what's happened to some degree, and this is speculation, hypothesis, but the Skype content and all that stuff that isn't quite relevant anymore, given that Microsoft's producing the 740, which is a troubleshooting and a support exam, I think some of the stuff that might have been looking at going in that 740 is kind of slotting in here into an MS700, and that's maybe where the 720 might not have enough space to be its own qualification and its own exam, because kind of stuff's kind of cascaded through a little bit. What that actually means is if you look at that setup here, and bear in mind the exams are random. They're not, you don't get questions on A, then B, then C, then D. They're all mixed through. That, if you are somebody doing this in the real world, actually this falls into 5 sort of categories. Again, if someone happens to have thought about how to structure this in a presentable way that, doesn't go out of date immediately. That effectively getting teams up and running, that's your planning. That's your, how do you do your network prep? How do you do your device prep? What sort of things do you need to put out? Then you've got your core functionality. That's like the basics of teams. How do you make a team? How do you do channels? What's the visibility look like? Advanced functionality is then your security and compliance, your wraparounds, making sure you're protecting your data, protecting your users, doing your auditing, looking after it. And then telephony, to me, maybe just because of my background, but telephony in Teams is a slightly different beast. It's not quite the same as doing meetings. It's not quite the same as doing Teams calling. Telephony has its own things with calling plans and direct routing and voice attendance and workflows and all that sort of stuff. And people usually, that's the area that people are probably weakest on out of all the MS700 stuff, because, if you know Skype for Business and used to do EV stuff, then telephony in Teams isn't that bad. But that's, it's a little bit more of a niche thing than the rest of, Teams. And then, looking at service reviews and troubleshooting and how you go about doing your quality checks. So, chances are if you're in that bracket of you've been doing this for 6 to 12 months, 2 years, whatever it may be, since Teams is a thing, that actually you're fairly familiar with quite a lot of those tasks. So it's just a case of looking at what you do know against the objectives and figuring out which bits, are areas that you're not necessarily as familiar with. Basics that you should know is you should be familiar with the different admin portals. Does anybody want to have a guess at how many admin portals Microsoft have? Any guesses? 6. No, that's the ones that you should be primarily familiar with for Teams. I think there's a guy who's pulled together, what's the website URL? It is msportals.io, which has a list of all the different Microsoft portals on it. If you do a Control F and search for HTTPS, you get 135 links are listed on that page to all the different portals. Now, some of those are niche. Some of them are things you will never ever visit, but there's a lot of them. For Teams, for this exam, you need to know about TAC, the Teams Admin Console, Teams Admin Center. I always call it console and it's not, it's the center. You need to know the M365 admin portal, the one where you can assign licenses to users, the general management where you add your domains, etc. The Azure AD portal, so some of the stuff about dynamic membership and group management is not stuff that you do in TAC, it's stuff that you do over in the Azure AD portal. So you might have never logged into that, so you want to make sure you've at least had a little, poke around and don't hit save. CQD is the core quality dashboard. That's where you look for trending of your real-time media in Teams. Again, if real-time media in Teams is not something that you've particularly spent time on, you might not have looked in there. The compliance portal is where you can look at things like alerting, set up DLP, some of the sensitivity items. The security and compliance portals, there's actually 3 of them. There's a legacy portal, then there's a compliance portal, and there's a security portal. Microsoft is in the middle of sort of shuffling around where stuff is in the particular thing. So hopefully in the exam, when you get a question, I can't guarantee it because I didn't write any of them, but you should be able to figure out, like, it should be the newer portals that you're looking at rather than the older portals, which is the separate ones, actually, the security and compliance. You should also be familiar to some degree with PowerShell. You don't have to memorize the PowerShell commandlets, but you will have questions which have 4 PowerShell answers. So you have to sort of understand what the syntax of a command looks like, roughly what the commandlet families that I refer to them as. So the family is, how you have like get dash, set dash, grant dash, remove dash, add dash, and then something. Be familiar with what that something is. And again, if you're looking through the exam, and you've got something that's like a insert dash, then that's not really going to be a real answer. That it's a red herring answer because that's not how PowerShell is structured. And there's also there's a specific question that kind of threw me out. There's things like, well, what PowerShell commandlet would you use to do this particular task? And it was like, go off and get an Azure AD thing and then run a TAC thing. So again, it's knowing how you can kind of block the PowerShell together is helpful. Understand how Teams policies apply. So there are some things that are Teams settings that apply at the global level, And there are then policies that there is an org-wide default policy, and then there are per user policies. So it's not like you used to have with AD and GPO where you had inheritance and some stuff would pull through. It is black and white that you either turn something off at the tenant level, or you have a global policy, or you have a user policy. And if Octavian, I don't want to allow you to be able to do something, you as a company have to decide whether that's something that you do at the org-wide level, or I make a policy and I assign it to Octavian and it only applies to his user. So again, when you're looking at the questions in the exam, there might be some that talk about how do you achieve a particular thing. And remember I said about just watch for what sort of wording is on the end, that it might be two answers, as one you do it at the org level and one is you do it at the user level. Which one do you pick? If you read the question carefully again, it might say without impacting other users. Then you do it at the user level, or you need to apply it as the default, then you do it at the org-wide global level. So in terms of running through this content, do people fancy trying their hand at some of the sample questions that I've got towards the back end of the presentation? Should I spend a little bit more time breaking down some of the tasks? Should we see how we go? A little bit of both. Should we go for a bit of both? Okay. So planning and configuring, roughly this is going to be approximately 25 questions on the exam. Breaking it down into the different sections, and again, you can grab these slides or you can go see the download from Microsoft about what's in there. Plan and configure your network settings. So be aware of the network planning tool, how you would use that, doing the bandwidth calculations for building a site map to say this site has this connection, this many users who are going to be doing video, therefore it's this amount of bandwidth that we might need. There's the network connectivity testing tool for how you assess the quality of a particular location or a user's computer. Be aware about how that works. The firewall and port requirements. There's the big Office 365 connectivity table. Be aware of what Teams uses. And realistically, that means be aware that you have TCP 443, but then media should be on UDP 347, 9, etc., like the 4, 5 port ranges that it uses. So you don't necessarily need to know all of it, but you need to just be able to spot it when it's in an answer again. The networking principles, avoiding proxy servers, not doing SSL inspection, all that sort of stuff. Building data, this is the question that threw me. So it used to be in CQD that you upload a CSV or a TSV with your building data that says this subnet is this location, so that you can then view where quality should be good because it's one of your locations versus where it's someone else's. They added into TAC the ability to upload the similar sort of a file and call it reporting label. So I read my question, it was like, you need to identify which location is having poor call quality. It's like, great, that's CQD. Read my answers. It's not mentioned anywhere. There's no building data about CQD. It's because it's reporting labels. So again, it's like there might be multiple ways of achieving the same thing. It's just being aware of those different choices. Being aware of QoS and what DSCP settings you can turn on, where you enable them. Weirdly, in Teams, that's hidden under the meeting settings in TAC. Don't know why it's in there, but that's where it's at. So again, familiarity with what's in TAC and being able to click through it, you'll know roughly where you need to go to do something. This is a new section that's been added, and it's interesting that it's explicitly in there, the licensing requirements. So you should be familiar with what the difference between a Teams E3 and a Teams E5 is, and the answer is to do with the phone system license and the audio conferencing license. Be aware of what those different SKUs are with comms credits, how you use them. If you want to have toll-free numbers into your tenant in the telephony section later, you need to have comms credits in your tenant. So again, you need to know that sort of stuff. The types of licenses that you can apply to meeting rooms or common area phones, again, more on the telephony side of things. But also, there's going to be particular attention, I understand, to when you might need an Azure AD P1 versus a P2 for some of the security compliance stuff. So the things around sensitivity labels, dynamic membership, access reviews, whether you need a P1 or a P2. Because again, a question might be, you have this setup with this license, this isn't working, what's the answer? The answer will be you need a P2 instead of a P1 potentially. Understand the different RBAC roles. There's some predefined roles, so know where Microsoft intends those to be used. Looking at things like those advanced security compliance stuff, retention, DLP, information barriers. And again, this is back to these might be things that you haven't actually done in the real world. You might have been using Teams for 12 months, running it for your company, but you might never have done information barriers. So information barriers, you need to build, like, it's a way of splitting users so they can't communicate with each other, where you need to have, you know, virtual walls between them. But there's some gotchas in there that you build your, you know, group of people here, your group of people here, but then you need bi-directional rules. So you don't just say A can't talk to B, you have to say B can't talk to A at the same time. So that's a nice opportunity for a question that you've done this, you've said two groups, you've said A can't talk to B, why is it still working as well? Because B can't talk to A. So it's, again, it's these little bits and pieces. But these are things that in the docs.microsoft.com, you know, if you go read the section about information barriers, that will be in there somewhere telling you that you need to do those things. Security, an emphasis on, you know, account authentication, MFA, how that's set up. Again, it's bleeding into kind of more general tenant admin, not necessarily specifically something to do with Teams. Governance, I was talking about your user versus org-wide policies, how you can do policy packages, and then the Azure AD stuff. So because every team that's created sits on top of an M365 group, actually a lot of the things that you might want to do inside Teams is stuff that you have to do to the M365 group. So maybe you want to restrict the creation of groups to only be a certain, or teams, sorry, to be only a certain group of people in your organization. That's not something you do in Teams. That's not something you do in TAG. That's something you do in Azure AAD, but it affects how that operates in Teams. So again, you need to be aware of what's in one portal versus what's in another portal. This one's an interesting one. Being aware or have an understanding of what a user is versus a guest versus an external federated user versus an anonymous user. Anonymous. Because a user who's in one of your meetings might have different access to somebody who is a guest versus someone who's anonymous. So it might be that they've signed in, you know, and they are a guest in one of your teams, but that then means that because your tenant knows about them and technically they've authenticated, they're treated differently to someone from the same organization who isn't a guest in one of your teams. And so you can get different policies applying that. And also guest access is controlled in a few different places. So just because in Teams you say that you're allowed to do guest access, that doesn't mean that your Azure AD settings allow you to invite guests into the M365 group itself. There might be a separate you know, allow or block list there that needs to be configured. And just because you've got Azure AAD allowing external people in to a group and you've got that configured inside Teams, because we're then using SharePoint for file storage, that still doesn't necessarily guarantee that you've got a setting that turns off access to guest users inside SharePoint from accessing files. So it's knowing how these kind of layers fit together. Dealing with devices, the main types of devices are going to be your meeting room devices and your phones. So just being broadly aware of things like the Microsoft Teams rooms or the Microsoft Teams rooms on Android, or the types of, you know, a native Teams phone, how you manage them, where you set them up. Again, what you can do in TAC for pre-staging them and for allowing authentication. Managing chat, teams, apps and channels. Be aware of how you can convert existing groups, how you can use templates for creating your teams, the discoverability and visibility. So you can have public or private or org-wide teams, but you can then have a private, visible or hidden team. So the privacy controls whether people can join it without having to be allowed, but the discoverability is covering whether you can search for it and find it in the Teams directory or not. So again, there's different layers of things to consider there. Stuff like dynamic membership fits under here. Again, dynamic membership is something that's actually an Azure AD thing, where you can build a rule and say, I want people who are in this department to be part of this group. And it's understanding what happens when you turn that on and what it looks like, but then also understanding that that's an Azure P2, I think, license that you need to be able to do that. So again, it's that, you know, threading it all through. Channels, what's a standard channel versus what's a private channel? And you will probably start seeing content around shared channels as that rolls out of preview and tap and becomes a thing. And that's going to be interesting because that's actually quite a complicated thing that's happening under the scene. So, you know, there's quite a lot of identity logistics and management and that sort of stuff. Chat versus a conversation, where different settings apply. So if you want to block the use of GIFs or emojis in your conversations, are you blocking that in one-to-one chat? Are you blocking that in a conversation in a team? Are you blocking that in a meeting? Maybe you have to block it across all three. So again, it's, you know, it's knowing and understanding where the different policies and bits and pieces are. The section on apps, understanding the difference between a first-party app, which is something published by Microsoft, so Planner would be a first-party app that you can integrate with Teams, versus a third-party, maybe like the Salesforce app plugin or an Adobe plugin that you can add into your Teams, versus something that you have custom built. If you've custom built it, how you deploy that into your tenants, deploy that into your users' clients. How you can do things like sideloading, and what the difference between an app setup policy and an app permission policy. So one controls what people are allowed to install, and the other controls how you can force it to be shown down the left-hand side of pinned items in the client. So, figuring out the differences between those things. Calling in meetings, approximately 11 questions on that. Don't forget there is live events. So even if you, again, you might not have touched on this in the real world, if you're familiar with how to use Teams meetings, Teams live events are technically part of the exam because it's part of what you get with the Teams functionality. So you need to be aware of what the difference between a presenter versus a publisher, or the different roles that are specific to live events. So go and have a play with it. Go do it if you can in your tenant. Audio conferencing, a little bit of an overlap with the telephony kind of stuff, understanding how you provision numbers, what toll-free versus toll numbers and what the implications are. Managing phone numbers is a bit of a misleading title because it's not really about managing phone numbers, but you should understand at a high level the difference between calling plans and direct routing and where you might choose to use them in different scenarios. The exam is not going to go super detailed on direct routing, but you do need to at least understand how you troubleshoot a gateway, or how you can configure a gateway in your tenant, but it's not going to go super deep on things like local media optimization and all those kinds of things. Managing numbers, how you provision them, not necessarily how you port them, but how you can go and get new numbers from Microsoft and how you assign them against your users. And then how you can control the policies. And there's a number of policies. One in particular, I don't know if it's on, was it on the previous one? But it's how to do emergency services handling, particularly, it's a big thing in the States. How do you deal with E911? And there's location is handled in 3 different places. You've got trusted IP, you've got network settings, and you've got the location information services, and they all play a different part in how the client presents its location to the remote party. And call queues and auto attendance as well, understanding how those kind of link with each other and where you might use one or the other. Monitoring and reporting. So it's a big thing, around adoption, change management, making sure that users are using the product in the way that you anticipate that they are using them. So there's you'll likely have a few questions around how do you trend usage, or where should you go? And for Teams, there's 3 different places, broadly speaking, that you can go look for that. You can do CQD for the audio, you can do some level of reporting in TAC, and you can do a level of reporting out of the portal, but also CQD, you can use Power BI desktop to download or to pull live information out of CQD, and that might be something that you're asked about as well. How you might monitor what's going on, guest access, team creation, how you configure alerts to be told when people are doing particular things in your tenant. Again, it's maybe not something that you do day to day as an administrator, but remember that, be the enterprise administrator headspace of, well, I do want to know when someone makes a new team or they delete a team so I can archive it instead, or make sure that people have done the right thing. And then troubleshooting audio, video issues. Again, this is that new section that I was talking about that's kind of come in here. Know how you can download the logs out of the client, how you can do basic troubleshooting, where you might use call analytics versus CQD. CQD being the big picture and call analytics being the narrow view of a particular user had a particular problem with a particular call that you can drill into that. So that's a very whistle-stop tour of some of the areas of content. And then, as long as we're allowed to keep going, I think I've got 7 or so questions just to give you a feel for what the wording and what how the structure of the questions might go. So, you ready? You recently added a domain to the external access allow list. Oh, no, I'm reading the wrong one. There we go. That'll teach me to use presenter view. I can't read it from here. Anyway, hands up. Who thinks what answer? Go on then. D. Yeah, it's D. So again, it's if you look at how the question is structured, you get some clues there. So back to that, you don't always necessarily need to know the detail of the ports, but you should be aware that bad call quality, correlated with you've got a high volume of TCP traffic. Therefore, if you look down the answers, well, Quaz isn't necessarily going to help you. It might do. Network assessment could be a valid answer, but that will tell you that you've got a problem, but it doesn't necessarily tell you what the problem is. The network persona is just for planning purposes, but again, it is related to how you can plan and map that stuff. So yeah, the answer will be D, because it's TCP is used for Teams, but UDP is the preference for media. Add a domain to your external allow list for federation. No other domains are in the list. Users are reporting that they now can't communicate with people that they used to be able to do. What should you do to quickly resolve the issue? Do you A, disable external access before re-enabling it with a new configuration? So, you know, is it a turn it off and turn it on again type scenario? Do you make sure that Skype hybrid is configured? Do you remove the whitelist domain, allow list domain that you just added? Or do you update the user policies to allow guest access? So again, it could be in multiple places, but if you look for the clue that's in the question, the clue is that you recently changed something and that's when the functionality stopped. So even if you're not sure, you can hazard a guess that it is C. Because you added a domain into the allow list, the way that works is as soon as you put any domain in there, that immediately disallows every other domain that isn't in the list. And that's different to what used to happen in Skype. It used to be that that just gave it a different level of permission to have a higher access rate. In Teams, that cuts it off. So again, there's a little bit of a clue there. You want to make sure that only your heads of departments are able to create teams. You have a security group containing, I really typoed these, sorry, containing these users already. The reason might be that maybe if you say written these for something else and you wanted to repurpose them without specifically getting into trouble about repurposing content, then you would rephrase them slightly. So what could you do here? So if you look down the answers, use the set as your AD directory setting commandlet to give the heads of department permissions to make new groups. That sounds all right. That's possible. That's using the department group that we've got. I'm not sure if it's specifically that commandlet that we use. You know, I might be right, but I'm not entirely sure. Do we make all the users team service administrators? Right. Enterprise admin hat on. Yes, that would work, but that's not something that we want to do because that's bad practice. So let's rule that one out. Assign the group the user's RBAC role. Well, is that something that we could do? Probably. Is that going to allow them to do something else? Yes, probably not that one. Use the set as your AD directory settings commandlet to give each member permissions to the create groups. Aha, well, I've now got two questions that have the same commandlet in it. So chances are that wording on the commandlet is probably going to be right. But which one do I pick? Do I pick A or do I pick D? You pick A. Because enterprise thinking, you're using that group that you've already got. And the clue is in the fact that it has given you a group. It tells you that there is a group that is already there that you can use and repurpose for this. You want to find a way to automatically, clue, tidy up and remove old teams that are no longer in use. And some of those teams no longer have owners. Another clue. What should you do? Requires the least admin overhead. Remember that little clue at the end of the text. So do you do access reviews for the tenants and enable the justifications that only teams with an owner can respond? Well, that sounds like that might be okay, but I've said that I'm not sure that all of my teams have owners anymore, so maybe not that. Enable the audit logging on the tenant and manually do some stuff, blah, track it by hand. That's not really the enterprise way of doing something. Surely there's a neater way of doing it that uses a built-in tool instead of hacking something together that I've done. Do you use group expiry? Sounds promising. For the tenant, and make sure that you specify the admin mailbox as a fallback address. Aha, a fallback address. If I've got a team that doesn't have an owner, then that's going to come to the administrator, me, to validate and check through by hand. That's looking pretty promising. Create a script to check for teams with no owner and schedule the script to run. Sure, that would work, but it's not the enterprise way of doing stuff. So the answer is C. So do you see what I mean about, you know, it's in the interpretation of the questions. You configure information barriers in your tenant for the first time. You've noticed that the impacted users are not automatically removed from the existing conversations. So what should happen when you do IB is if you've got users who are in group chats with each other, before you apply the policy, they should be removed from the chats as the policy kicks in and applies, okay? You confirm that the segmentation is correctly configured. So that means you know you've got group A and you've got group B. What should you also check? Do you ensure that the information barrier policy is being applied to their team? Well, possibly, but it's saying that they're removed from conversations. So that doesn't necessarily mean that, it doesn't say they're not being removed from a team. It's the conversation. So that could be, multi-party chat that they're doing that they're not being removed from. So possibly that one. Do you manually run the information barrier policy from the admin portal? Give it a kick. Maybe that could be feasible. Do you wait for Azure AD Connect to synchronize the users? Yes, because everything takes 48 hours or longer. If it hasn't worked, it just means that you need to wait longer. But does it apply in our scenario? Yeah, possibly not. Option D, what have we got here? Make sure that you've authorized the Information Barriers app to be able to operate in your tenant. Now, didn't do this myself, but when I read through the docs.microsoft.com, there was something about there was this app that you had to enable to allow it, Information Barriers, to do its thing. So if it's not A, or it could be A, and it's not C, it might be B, but there's that thing that I remember that, there was a little bit about. I'm going to go for D. It's D. You have to do the Information Barrier app to give it permissions to do the thing in your tenant. So even though you've configured everything correctly, there's the one little piece that you haven't done. Okay. You've got users in Spain who need to be able to make PSTN calls. You currently have E3 licenses and you want to use numbers from Microsoft. Why would you use anything else? What are the minimum additional licenses that you should purchase? Select all that apply. So do you convert those users from E3 to an E5? Would that work? Yeah. Do you add calling plan domestic license to those users? Well, that's the license that allows people to have minutes to make calls when they're on Microsoft numbers, right? So, okay, that feels like that's one of them. Do we add audio conferencing license? Well, what does an audio conference license do? That's to do with dial in for a meeting. Doesn't say anything about that in the question, but I know it's related to PSTN, so it's probably not likely to be that one. Do we need a phone system license? Yes, we do need a phone system license to do anything related to Teams phone while we're doing our deployment. So select all that apply and the minimum additional licenses. So we could just do A, that would do what we needed, plus a calling plan to give us our minutes, because that's not in the E5. Or we could do phone system and calling plans. Now, Microsoft would love you to have the answer as E5 because you get all this other stuff and it costs more. But the answer probably in this scenario actually is you want phone system and you want a calling plan. So even when there are multiple choices that are valid, it's that thinking about how you're processing the wording on the question. I think this might be your last one. This is your last one. So you need to add a new SBC to your tenant. Okay, fine. Using PowerShell. Ooh, this might be tricky. The SBC is called blur, and it is on port blur. What commandlets should you run? Well, let's have a look at them. A, first of all, just pass down what the PowerShell commandlets are. So new CS Online PSTN gateway. Sounds about right. Oh, look, answer B is also using that same commandlet. Okay. C, new PSTN gateway, new Teams PSTN gateway. Well, it sounds right, it starts with a new, but we've already got two that are using the same thing, and it's unlikely to be two wrong answers sharing the same root commandlet. New direct routing PSTN gateway. Yeah, okay. So chances are it's either going to be A or B because we've got that as our choices. So what's the other differentiator here? -FQDN, okay, doesn't help us. The other ones are -domain and -FQDN as well. And then we've got -port or -SIP signaling port. But if we look at C, that's doing SIP signaling and D is -port. So this one I've worded a bit badly. But you should be able to narrow down by looking at the other answers to rule out or rule in some of the ones that you're looking for. Does anybody know what the right one there is? No guesses? So what would you do in the real world exam? What you would do is you would flag it for review and you would move on because you might have another question later that then has something else about a gateway and has it. The answer's A. A is the right one that you should use. So, in conclusion, buy my book.
That was it.
Seriously. Yeah. You need to figure out of all that content and that whistle-stop overview of all the different things and what's in there, figure out what suits you best. For what works best for me is doing it. I learn best when I have an environment and I can mess around with it and I can play with it, and then I break something and then I go read about what I broke. But it might be that you do the other way, that you do better by reading, or maybe, go have a look on YouTube and there's videos of all people doing all sorts of things. Or there's some canned demos that walk you through from Microsoft the process for setting some of these things up. Don't forget that docs.microsoft.com is the Bible in terms of how you should be doing stuff for the MS700, because that is the official formal way that you do stuff. Ignore what you do in the real world. Obviously, apply that into the real world in your day jobs, but kind of park that a little bit for when you're doing the exam. There are a number of blogs. So Tom Talks from Tom Arbuthnot and a few others have, for the old format of the exam, a whole bunch of links that link you out to the right sections and the right places on TechNet, docs.com, docs.microsoft.com, for information about that. Try and get yourself a sample environment so you can play with it in the real world. Again, if you are a Microsoft partner or have access to someone who's friendly at a Microsoft partner, maybe if you come talk to us on our booth, we can hit you up with access to a CIE. But a CIE is perfect because you can do whatever you like and it doesn't matter. It's a real tenant with real licenses, properly accessible over the internet using the, MS blah, blah, blah number name. But you can do what you like and test all of this stuff in there. There are some courses. If you go on the MS700 site, there are some free Microsoft Learning resources and modules that walk you through some of these steps. There are instructor-led courses. There is an official practice test that you can buy, and Microsoft does have offers on every now and again. So they do, I think it's called Exam Replay. That is the one that they have at the moment, where you can buy your exam, but you pay a little bit more. You get access to a practice test, and you get the ability to retake the exam if anything goes wrong and you don't pass it on the first attempt. So it's kind of like an insurance policy. Oh, and of course, you can buy my book. Available in December in the UK and October in America. So there we go. Any questions?
Thanks very much, Ben. Any questions for Ben in the room?
Sorry, no, go for it. Adapted, like as in? Are the exams adaptive? Yeah, so I don't believe so. So it used to be that, if you answered a question wrong on group policy, that the next question would be a bit more about group policy and a bit more about group policy, but you could gain that to your advantage, because if you weren't sure about a question, you could flag it for review, get it wrong, and get another question that was similar that then gave you the clue that you needed to the first one. So no, I don't believe they are adaptive anymore. No.
We've got quite a few in the remote audience. If you do have a question for Ben, just raise your hand and I can unmute you.
Might as well leave it on that one, eh?
Okay, we've got no questions to the remote audience. Thank you very much, Ben. Definitely go check out his book and grab him outside if you've got any questions. That was a great session. Thank you. Right, I'll say goodbye to the remote audience.